Hello guys and welcome back to a brand new video from me, Pickles Park Reviews. I mean, of course it's from me. Who else did you expect to be introducing this video? Now, you may have taken a look at the title, a brief glance at the thumbnail, and thought to yourself that I do not know what I'm talking about, that possibly I might not even be a sane man. The 11th Doctor is a forgotten Doctor, an underrated incarnation. George, what the hell are you on about? I know you mentioned that you're an 11th Doctor fan every single video, but this is taking your bias a bit too far. And at first glance, I'd be inclined to agree with you. I've never considered the 11th Doctor underrated or forgotten about, because ultimately when you think about it, the 11th Doctor is a pretty popular Doctor. You don't hear that much slander against him, he's pretty universally liked. And ultimately, yeah, surely shouldn't the underrated Doctors be those who often get criticism and aren't looked upon as fondly and perhaps deserve more love, like Colin Baker, for example? Aren't those the underrated Doctors? Why on earth are you saying that the 11th Doctor is an underrated Doctor? And I would be inclined to agree with you. But I saw a Twitter thread the other day from a person named Ezekiel Thorpe, I think I've got that right. They described how ultimately the 11th Doctor is pretty forgotten about in terms of the show itself, in terms of the references to the Matt Smith era in the current show. And it really got me thinking that actually the 11th Doctor and his era is pretty forgotten about on the whole. There's references here and there, but ultimately the main show, the Jodie Whittaker era, doesn't seem to particularly want to reference the Matt Smith era in any way, really, and there's not much fan service for that era of the show. Now, is that me saying that this era is underrated? Not at all. That doesn't really make an era underrated just because it doesn't get many nostalgia callbacks in the current show. But I just thought it was pretty interesting to maybe, you know, dive into the other aspects, because it really got me thinking about how the 11th Doctor is pretty underrated as a whole within the fan base, within the show, and looking at perhaps why that is, because I do think there is a reason why, unfortunately, the 11th Doctor's era and his Doctor as a whole is pretty overlooked. Now, looking at the show itself, the 11th Doctor era doesn't get many callbacks or references, as I mentioned before. And I wanted to look at why that was, and I think why that was is purely because of the existence of David Tennant and the 10th Doctor. Now, ultimately, the 11th Doctor and the 10th Doctor are very different, but on the surface, they're quite similar. They're both youngish, quirky Doctors that were reasonably popular, but while on the surface they seem to be quite similar, one is more popular than the other. They're both popular, but ultimately the 10th Doctor is much more popular. And the era he's from, the RTD era, the 10th Doctor's era is much more popular than the 11th Doctor's eras. So ultimately, when you've got two relatively similar Doctors, it's pretty obvious which one the BBC is going to choose to reference, which is the 10th Doctor era and the RTD era. Now, I don't think it takes an idiot to suggest that the only reason that we get so many RTD era callbacks in the current show is because ultimately they're saying wink wink nudge nudge, you remember the good old days of Doctor Who, it's still the same show, please, it's still the same show, please watch our show. All it is a desperate attempt to try and bring people back to the show. The callbacks aren't really there because of some love for the show. Unfortunately, to look at it in quite a cold and calculated way, it's purely there to bring in viewership. That's the only reason that there are so many callbacks in the current era of the show, in Series 12 and Revolution of the Daleks. In some ways, if you're doing that, it makes sense why you'd reference the RTD era and the 10th Doctor era over the 11th Doctor era, because ultimately, the 11th Doctor era, while popular, just isn't as popular as the 10th Doctor era, and they're only going to choose one, so that's why you get the 10th Doctor just given to you so much. And the 10th Doctor era has really been oversaturated recently. Not just in the main show, you've got stuff like Time Lord Victorious, for example, based around the 10th Doctor. You've also got The Game, The Edge of Something, I think it's called, essentially, where Jodie Whittaker teams up with David Tennant's Doctor. The 10th Doctor is being shoved in our faces because it's what the BBC think is what we like. It's what the BBC considers the glory days of the show, and it's what the BBC thinks that the fans consider the glory days of the show. Yes, the RTD era is the most consistent written era of the revival, but ultimately it's not the only era. I think the BBC sometimes get wept up in the RTD era is the only era because that's where it gave us consistent viewing figures, and that's where it constantly references it. Now, how does that, overblown Tennant nostalgia affect the 11th Doctor and why his era is underrated? Now, it's simply because the 10th Doctor era being in all this merchandise in the show itself overshadows the 11th Doctor because ultimately people consider the 11th Doctor to be similar than the 10th Doctor. So ultimately, the 11th Doctor's popularity is never going to be bigger than the 10th Doctor. Perhaps the only time it was when Matt Smith was actually the Doctor. He was loved at the time. I think a lot of people forget this, but ultimately people loved the Matt Smith era and his Doctor. It was a big thing at the time. The general public adored it. I mean, I wasn't on Twitter at the time, obviously, because I was about 7. So ultimately, I don't know what the general fan consensus was, but I imagine it was pretty positive, at least early on in the Matt Smith era. So the era was pretty well received at the time, but because of the 10th Doctor era, and it just being that little bit more popular, that's what gets focused on by fans and the show itself, and it ultimately leaves the 11th Doctor era a bit overshadowed. Now you may be thinking, that's all fine for the 10th Doctor era and the RTD era as a whole, but you've also got the 12th and 13th Doctor eras as well. How can you say that the 11th Doctor era is more underrated than those eras? Now, I can suggest this, and my main reason is because those eras get spoken about a lot because of their divisiveness. Now, the Capaldi era was slated at the time, I think it's fair to say it had its fans, but ultimately the reception from the general public and also a lot of fans at the time, I specify at the time, was pretty negative. So ultimately at the time and in years since especially, people run to defend it. If someone says that something you like is bad, you're obviously going to rush to defend it. And with everything that people don't like at the time, you're always going to get a cult following of people who like it after the fact. Why do you think you get so many cult classic movies that people hated at the time but love now? It's because ultimately things that are hated at the time will get a fan base later on. It's something like BVS. No one liked BVS at the time, but now it's got a cult following and has led DC to make the Snyder Cut of Justice League. That's the reason for this, because ultimately things that are slated at the time will get a fan base later on. There's many Capaldi stan accounts online, very vocal. It's not even stan accounts, just people in general. People who really like the Capaldi era are particularly vocal about it, and people who dislike the Capaldi era are particularly vocal about it. When you've got these extremes of people really loving it and people really hating it, then ultimately that era is going to be spoken about quite a lot. It's the same with the 13th Doctor era. Obviously it's the current era of the show, so ultimately that era is going to be spoken about a fair bit, but people who hate it won't stop going on about it, and people who love it also won't stop going on about it. So ultimately that era is going to stay in the mind for quite a while, presumably long after this era has actually ended. But the 11th Doctor era, out of all the eras of the Revive series, is perhaps the one that gets spoken about the least. And that is because ultimately when you think about it, when you really think about it, the general consensus of the 11th Doctor era, well, that's just it. There is a general consensus of the 11th Doctor era. What's the general consensus of the Capaldi era? There isn't one, because there's so many varied opinions. The 11th Doctor era has a very rare case where the general consensus is pretty much there. Fans pretty much agree on the 11th Doctor era. Now ultimately there's variation, but most people would say that Series 5 is great, Series 6 is okay, and Series 7 is bad. Now I'm not saying everyone agrees with this. I don't agree with this, to be quite honest with you. I don't think Series 7 is as bad as people say. I think Series 6 is pretty decent, and you guys all know that I worship Series 5, but to be honest, I don't really disagree that Series 7 is quite weak. I don't really disagree that Series 6 is pretty middle of the road, and obviously I agree that Series 5 is amazing. and even people who don't think it's amazing will acknowledge that it's one of the better series of the revival. You don't really tend to get people who massively disagree with Series 5 being good, Series 6 being okay, and Series 7 being bad. You don't really see people disagreeing with that because it's the general consensus across fans. Everyone seems to agree with that, oddly, and because, oddly enough, people seem to agree on it, therefore there's never really that much room for discussion, and hence the 11th Doctor Era just isn't spoken about that much. If people dislike the 11th Doctor Era, it's usually because they dislike the Moffat Era as a whole, and if they dislike the Moffat Era as a whole, they'll probably dislike the Capaldi Era more, and therefore the Capaldi Era will be the thing they'll speak about more. Moffat detractors will focus on the Capaldi Era because I think it's pretty universally accepted, or not universally accepted because I know people do disagree with this, but it's pretty widely accepted that the Moffat Era is a pretty downward trajectory that kind of ends higher, but yeah, it kind of goes down, it's kind of down, and then kind of goes briefly up at the end. The Moffat Era is a bit of a downward trajectory. I mean, I'm sorry for Capaldi fans who will hate me for saying that, but that's what I believe anyway, and that's what a lot of people believe. So people who dislike Moffat will ultimately rip into the Capaldi Era more than the Smith Era, because while they may dislike the Smith Era, the problems in the Smith Era are only amplified in the Capaldi Era, so people will dislike the Capaldi Era more, and that's where you get the vocal negativity about the Capaldi Era. And then obviously, because the Capaldi Era was hated, then you will get people running to defend it, because as I said, anything that's hated will probably develop a cult following, and that's what the Capaldi Era has. The 11th Doctor Era is just kind of stuck in a state of meh. It was popular at the time, and now people just tend to agree on it. People acknowledge its high points, acknowledge its low points, but ultimately there's not really much room for discussion. Things remain topics in the fandom because of how diverse they are, because of how much discussion can be ranged on a topic. Ultimately, the 11th Doctor Era doesn't really have the highs of the RTD era for most people, but also for most people doesn't have the lows of perhaps the Capaldi Era and the Whittaker Era, so ultimately it's left in a weird state of limbo, where no one really talks about it because it's just kind of there. The problems in it are amplified in the Capaldi Era, and the highs, many people would say, well, the RTD era just had higher highs. So ultimately it's just kind of left in a state of limbo. People just don't really talk about it because they just have different things to talk about in other eras. I think it's quite similar actually to the Peter Davison era, because people will say that the Pete Davidson era doesn't reach the heights of 70s or 62, and people who really dislike the John Nathan Turner era will criticise the Colin Baker and McCoy eras more, particularly the Colin Baker era, because that is where the problems with JNT Doctor Who are more present in than Davison's era, which is kind of a weird middle ground between the highs of the 70s and the lows of the 80s. It's just kind of there. I feel like that's very similar with the Smith era, and ultimately that is a shame because I think there's some brilliant stuff in the Smith era. It's one of my favourite eras of Doctor Who. I mean, I am biased. Smith was my first Doctor. He'll always be my favourite Doctor. I have that attachment to Matt Smith's Doctor that I'll never have with any other Doctor. I think we can all relate to that feeling of your first Doctor. Your first Doctor, you never lose that attachment from. Or sometimes you just know that your favourite Doctor will always be your favourite Doctor. That's the case with me with Matt Smith. I just have such an attachment to his Doctor. When I think of the Doctor, he's the first thing I think about. So I'm always going to be a defender of his era. I'm always going to get more enjoyment out of certain stories that have him in that other people will regard as throwaway. That's why I get more out of Series 6 and 7 than most people, because I just really like Matt Smith. So I think it's a shame when you see his era just kind of forgotten about. You know, admittedly, I wouldn't like it to just be clowned upon, but I don't feel like the Capaldi era even gets clowned upon. I feel like it does, but also it gets some very high praise from people who love it. You get constant arguments about the Capaldi era. But the Smith era is just kind of there, and I think that's a real shame, to be honest with you. I think it suffers from being very similar to the RTD and Capaldi era, but on none of the extremes. It's just kind of there. It's the beginning of the downfall of Moffat, but it also has some of those tropes that people liked in the RTD era. They're putting it in a weird little bubble, where people will, if they praise the Smith Era, would rather praise the IDER Era, and if they dislike the Smith Era, would rather hate on the Capaldi Era. It's as simple as that. The Smith Era ultimately is just a bit forgotten about, particularly in Modern Who, and it's easily the most forgettable era of Modern Who for most people in terms of what you really hear about it, in terms of the eras you see people talking about and raving about or not raving about. The Smith Era very rarely gets brought up, and I think that's a real shame. And as someone who really likes Matt Smith's Doctor, I certainly think that we should speak about his Doctor a bit more. We should speak about his era a bit more, positive or negative. I think there's some real great stuff in there, some real underrated stories that I think should just get more love. And I just think it would be great if we could talk about the Smith Era more, because I do think that it's a particularly underrated part of modern Doctor Who and Doctor Who as a whole. Just because it was received well at the time, I think it's now sunk into a space, particularly in the fandom, but also in the main show, where it's just kind of there, and on both of the extremes, people don't really talk about it all that much, and that is a shame. I think it's odd that the consensus amongst fans is that the opinions on it is relatively decided. That's kind of odd about it, so I think that certainly contributed, but I do think it is a victim of its own success, just being pretty good, but also not being awful. I think it's like the definition of a meh period for most people, and that's ultimately why it's not spoken about, and that's ultimately why it's pretty forgotten about. I would say though that it's underrated. I am biased, but I just think we should speak about it more, because I really enjoy it, and ultimately I would like the Smith Era to not be forgotten about. Fingers crossed. Yes, thank you guys for watching. If you enjoy this video, leave a like, drop us up, and hit that notification bell to stay notified for all my latest videos. I hope you enjoyed this video. I think it's something pretty different, but I feel like I've got a unique take on this. And yeah, I just thought it was pretty interesting. It's not something that you really hear from most people. It's not something I really thought about until I saw something on Twitter, and that just made my mind go, whoa, maybe the Smith Era is actually pretty forgotten about. So, you know, hopefully I may have opened your mind to amazing new things, and yeah, I just hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any thoughts, if you agree with me, if you don't, drop it in the comment section below. I'd love to hear them, read them, and ultimately begin a discussion. You know, anything about the Smith Era we can talk about would be great. If you want to hear more thoughts of mine on the Smith Era, then I do have some reviews of Series 5 and 6 that I did a few months ago. I've recently been redesigning the thumbnails for those, and the Series 7 review will be coming out very soon. So ultimately, if you're excited for that, subscribe and go back and watch those other videos if you want to. But yes, regardless, thank you guys for watching. Talk about the Smith Era, and of course, goodbye.